So if y'all haven't seen Katie Miller yet, she's Stephen Miller's wife. And believe it or not, she's every bit as vile, maybe even more disgusting than he is. And that's really saying something. When I first saw Stephen Miller, I said, there's no way that a guy like that could ever get laid. But trust me, they always can. And they can always find someone just as low down and despicable as they are who will absolutely go to bat for them and prop up their views, or wait until after they die and continue to grift off their death at WWE style memorials. That's the type of people that we're up against. So Katie Miller goes on Abby Phillips recently, and they're sitting around talking. They're talking about Nick Fuentes sitting down with Tucker Carlson. More and more people are calling for people on the right to call out people like Nick Fuentes, who is anti-Semitic and who looks at Adolf Hitler as a hero. People wants to see MAGA and the Republican Party call white supremacists out, but they can't do that, and they won't do that. What they'll do is they'll sit and twist it, and they will hold podcasters to a higher standard than they hold the President of the United States or anyone in his regime. So Jennifer Welch from the I've Had It podcast, who I know we all love, she recently, or has always pretty much called Stephen Miller a white supremacist because that's what he is. And so Katie Miller here tries to twist this, that it's the same thing, that Tucker Carlson sitting down with a white supremacist somehow is just as bad as Abby sitting down with Jennifer Welch for calling Stephen Miller a white supremacist. I know it makes absolutely no sense, but if you've never seen this woman, brace yourself. She's every bit as disgusting as her husband.
About whether someone like Tucker Carlson, who is a very powerful force in the conservative movement.
You host people on your show all the time who call my husband and myself a Nazi. So how is that any different from Tucker Carlson going on Nick Fuentes having Tucker Carlson on his show? It's not different.
He's actually
anti-Semitic. He's anti-Semite.
A Hitler admirer. Nick Fuentes is actually a Hitler admirer.
But he literally is not a good human being.
That is a different thing.
Excuse me, you have Jennifer Welch on your show very often, and you've never pushed back as she has called my husband a white nationalist.
Hold on.
That is no different than Nick Fuentes going on Tucker Carlson's show. It's not, and you should admit it.
Well, hold on. Wait, hold on. How is it anything similar? It's not remotely similar at all. Nick Fuentes sits around and says that he likes Hitler. How is that similar
Katie have to do with that? What does she have to do with that?
Hold on.
She has nothing to do with that. Literally nothing.
Scott, Katie is the person who just said to me that it is comparable to say that Nick Fuentes, who is literally a neo-Nazi, is the same as somebody, a liberal, who has an opinion, who is not a neo-Nazi. They are not
a hateful opinion.
The same.
How do you want? Excuse me. Let's go back to this point one more time.
But
Nick
Katie,
Fuentes can espouse an opinion on Tucker Carlson's show.
It is not the same.
And he didn't push back the same way you didn't push back when someone called someone in my family a Nazi.
Hold on a second.
It's not different.
Hold on a second.
It's not.
If someone comes on this show and says, I love Hitler and I admire what he did, they would never, first of all, I would never invite them on the show and they would never be invited back. So those two things are not the same thing.
But yet you've gone on Jennifer Welch's podcast. It's the same thing.
They are not the same thing.
It is not the same thing, and even though she is batshit crazy, I don't know how she pulled that one out because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And notice how that Scott Jennings chimes in to go, what does she have to do with that? What does she have to do with that? You never hear them say, wait a minute, stop, hold on. Just stop for a minute. We do not love Adolf Hitler. Fuck that guy. We are not white supremacists and fuck white supremacists. You never hear them say that. They don't chime in to say that. They hold a podcaster and they hold a host to a higher standard than they do the President of the United States, the Vice President, or anyone in his regime. So if Jennifer Welch looks over and calls a white supremacist a white supremacist, oh no, she can't do that. You didn't push back on that. You let her say that. But then they won't call out Tucker Carlson for not pushing back on Nick Fuentes, nor will they call out Donald Trump for inviting him to Mar-a-Lago. So I always say this, but those are the type of people we're up against. If someone was to refer to me as a Nazi, trust me, I would go as hard in the paint as possible to say, listen, I disavow that shit. I don't believe in that shit. I never will believe in it. You would see me go as hard in the paint as I possibly could to distance myself from that and disavow that. And if I'm going to be real with you. Yes, I'm part of the Midas Touch Network. If I saw Ben Marcellus sitting down with Nick Fuentes and he sat there and absolutely just let him walk all over him and never pushed back, which I know Ben wouldn't do that, but if he did, I couldn't work with him and I would call him out. I'd be like, I can't do this, dude. There's no way. And I know he would do the same to me because that's what reasonable people do. But we just continue to hold podcasters to a higher standard than we do the President of the United States, and it absolutely pisses me off. But this is one of the clips that Katie was referring to when Abby was on the I've Had It podcast, and she just didn't push back on Jennifer Welch calling a white supremacist a white supremacist. Take a look.
Stephen Miller is a white supremacist. I mean, he is, and he's basically running the White House. They keep Trump busy with his decorating projects. He's got building the arch now. He's got his Oval Office design. And then you have these real sociopaths that are real anti-Semites, true white supremacists like Stephen Miller. And even though he's Jewish, he's like a Nazi Jew.
Well, look, I can't speak to what Stephen Miller's motivations are. I've met him. I've talked to him. I've interviewed him.
How tall is he?
Yeah, we're dying to know.
Oh God, I can't remember that.
Short?
I truly cannot remember. Okay. I am short, so my understanding of people's height is not great. And I do think that you have to understand what motivates the people who are in power. If people are in power, you got to understand what their ideology is. Like truly understand what motivates them, where they're going. And I do think that is, that requires listening. I mean, I listen to what the Steve Bannons of the world say, I listen very carefully to what Stephen Miller says.
And I do understand listening very carefully to what they're saying. I understand listening to them and understanding where it is that they're coming from. But at the same time, while I can see that, I can also see how that platforming these people and not pushing back has what got us to this point. Because at one point in time, these people like the Nick Fuenteses, they were on the fringe. They were on the outside. They weren't in the mainstream. They weren't hanging out with the President of the United States because we had presidents in the past, Democrat and Republican, who would call out people like Nick Fuentes. But this president can't. This vice president won't. Stephen Miller sure as hell won't. His wife sure as hell won't. None of them will. Instead, they will try to twist it and set and hold a podcaster to a higher standard and try to compare that. And folks, it does not compare at all. Jennifer Welch called Stephen Miller a white supremacist because that's what he is. He mirrors 1930s Germany. Over on my Patreon and members only, I've been breaking down this book on tyranny. 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. I highly recommend this book. If you sit and read this book chapter by chapter, and they're short, by the way, if you sit and read each chapter, when he goes back and shows you what Hitler did in the 1930s and how he went about it, it absolutely mirrors everything that Stephen Miller is doing today. And they will not distance themselves from it. They think that we're just saying those things because we're trying to win an argument or because, we're just throwing words around for the fun of it. We don't do that. We don't call people racist. We don't call people Nazis. We don't call people white supremacists to be divisive. We call it out for what it is. And not calling it out for what it is and allowing these people into the mainstream is what has led us to this point. The mainstream media sat back and they let Donald Trump wash this stuff. They let him push this stuff. The churches pushed this stuff. And they normalized and sane-washed it. And I grew up in a world, and so many of us did, we grew up in an America where Nazis was a bad word, and we could all come together on that. But you cannot get anyone in MAGA to condemn this shit. You cannot get them to call it out. And that's why I'm never going to give Marjorie Taylor Greene some kind of brownie points or some kind of pass because she suddenly decided to leave after she racked up all of her money from insider trading and left with her pension. I'm not going to give her 1 ounce of credit because when has she ever called out the Nick Fuentes of the world? When has she ever called out people like that? They don't. I'm not going to play the clip. I don't want to sit and listen to him. But Don Jr. was asked, why don't y'all call this out? Because these type of radicals are probably going to lead to you losing elections. And he would not call it out. They won't call it out, number one, because it's their base. And number two, because they're scared to death of it. So they just go along with it and they continue to let it into the mainstream. But if you go back to every time we waved a red flag and said, this ain't normal. If you go back to every time, it was people like us that got shouted down for saying it. When we pointed to Donald Trump and said, look, he just said there's good people on both sides and there's Nazis over here. Oh, that's not what he meant. You took it out of context. No, I didn't take it out of context because that rally in Charlottesville was called Unite the Right and Nazis showed up. And he said there were good people on both sides. I don't know about y'all, but trust me, if I am ever out at an event and people shows up with Nazi flags beside me, I will not stand there beside them. I will say, I don't know why the fuck they came to our event. I don't know why the hell they thought they were welcome. I will disavow it all day. You'll never hear me say, well, there was good people all over there. That's not what you do. But that's what Donald Trump did, and that's what got us to this point. So shout out to the I've Had It podcast. I love them, and I do enjoy Abby Miller. And I understand and respect her for listening to other people. But I do believe that the mainstream media platforming Nazis and white supremacists and then holding podcasters to a different standard is what led us to this point. And it's just truly disgusting that we're here. So yeah, I mean, I know it's easy to look at a Stephen Miller and say that dude could never get laid. But trust me, guys like that can always find a woman every bit as dirty and low down as they are. And Erica Kirk pretty much proved that.